Welcome to Camera Shake Podcast, episode 58, with me, Kirsten Nuts, and Nick Kirby, the podcast where we talk about photography, videography, making photos, making videos, and anything that's got anything to do with any of that. Now, before we get into it, though, just remember that we are not sponsored by anybody. So if you could hit the subscribe button, hit like, that would really help us out. We would really appreciate it. If you're listening on the audio version on Apple Podcasts, for example, leave us a little star rating, we'll review. That will go a long way. Now, that being said, let's get started.
Let's do it.
Cool. So we are back in the beautiful town of Eton, just outside of London, on our new set. I'm really quite enjoying the set.
I like it a lot. It's really quite comfortable. It's nice to look a bit different for a change, right?
Yeah, absolutely. New season, new set, as I say.
New season, new set.
Also, it's not midnight.
No, it's not. It's the other end of the spectrum now. It's just really early.
Yes, early mornings. So you actually record early in the morning today because I'm off on Hollybobs tomorrow.
Lazy.
That's it.
Where are you going?
I'm going to Devon. Yeah, Devon, the English countryside. It's actually the first proper getaway in, 18 months or something, 2 years almost.
Wow.
Yeah.
Wow, that's scary.
Yeah, it should be good though.
Yeah, it will.
So the only problem I have is I really don't know how to pack. I mean, I'm only going
How to pack. Do you know I gave up on packing, and what I mean by that is that I ended up traveling so much all the time for work and for holiday and whatnot over the years that I thought, you know what, I'm not worrying about it anymore. What's the worst that could happen? There's only a couple of things you must remember: passport, wallet, phone, and keys. Anything else you forget, okay. Worst case scenario, I just buy it when I get out there.
See, the thing is, my wife and I have very different mentalities when it comes to getting ready for a holiday.
Really?
Yeah, she basically wants us to pack today and then put all the luggage in the car already, right?
Wow.
So all we've got to do is get up, make some coffee, jump in our clothes, get in the car and leave.
Okay, so I'm all for that. Having stuff, I always make sure it's done the night before. Yeah. And so I literally just have toiletries and coffee, car, go.
I'm very different. On my planet, I basically go, right, I've got 10 minutes to get in the car. Where's my suitcase? I'm just going to throw some stuff in there. That's it. And of course you forget half of what you need, but that's just part of
that's a little too far the other way. I'm the night before, late the night before, and that's that. Unless that's only if it's an early morning flight. Yeah. If I'm not flying until the afternoon, I'm not going to do it until the day.
See, the other thing is, we're going to stay in this log cabin.
And it's not like you're going abroad either.
No, exactly. It's and it's only a few days. I mean, it's not like a 2-week holiday or something. So we're staying in this log cabin out in the countryside, which should be really awesome. But of course, I've seen some photos of the log cabin, and immediately I'm thinking, it's like a little porch, nice. And I'm thinking, I've got some really cool ideas, some cool photos there. So I'm packing all my lenses.
You're so not going to be allowed.
I'm packing a strobe, at least a softbox, and a sandbag and so on and so forth. So I was mentioning that to my wife this morning, and she was like, "Really?" I'm like, "Yeah, I've got some really good ideas."
You're so not going to be allowed.
You're
going to pack it all. None of it's going to come out. I guarantee it.
Well. I've got a great idea. I mean, actually, the cabin is situated in such a way that if and the weather should be good over the next few days, if we get a really amazing sky, I can see a really cool photo coming on there.
Oh, for sure.
So I want to be prepared. So definitely need a strobe.
Definitely. Do you use gradient filters by any chance?
No, not really.
You don't? No, I don't. There's a lot of sense in them.
Oh, for sure. 100%.
It's just one of those things you always forget and get lazy with using, I think, even if you've got them.
Well, I mean, see, the thing for me is, I'm not really much of a landscape photographer.
No.
I was thinking about getting into filters and gradient filters and, different big stoppers and whatever when I was sort of getting mentally ready to go into Canada last year because I really wanted to up my landscape photography game, as we discussed this on the podcast. Yeah. And so, I was thinking about, all right, I need to get into filters and just, get to grips with that a little bit more. But under normal circumstances, with the exception of a variable ND filter, I don't really use filters.
No.
Only for video, of course. But generally, like, yeah, photo. I mean, occasionally, maybe, but not really.
No. It's 'cause I've just been thinking about this recently because, I'm heading down to see my friend in Plymouth, probably August, September time, to hopefully do a bit more landscape style stuff for over the course of a few days.
Yeah.
I've been thinking I should probably invest in one. It might be useful while I'm down there, particularly if it's bright during the day.
Yeah.
Actually get some blues in the sky rather than
for sure
white.
Yeah. Well, I mean, it just depends on how you expose. I mean, there's absolutely there's a lot to be said for getting all that stuff in camera. But again, different horses for different courses, if that's your thing. I mean, the same thing. Were we talking about the, what is it called? The blue mist filter? Black mist filter, that's right. Were we talking about that last week? I can't remember now.
We didn't, no.
Yeah. So the black mist filter is actually a filter I've been looking at recently very seriously because I just...
awesome.
Yes, I've been doing some experimenting with different gels and stuff. And I just like the way that kind of broadens out the light source.
Yeah.
And it kind of adds some atmosphere into the...
You get different levels of those filters. And so right now I'm using a 1/8 black mist filter on this right now, what you're looking at the minute. And that doesn't do a lot. But what it does do, and this is the reason I went for 1/8, is if you look at skin with it on and the same shot without it on, it adds a slight smoothness to skin that you don't get otherwise.
So is that a direct effect of higher resolution cameras, though?
Might be.
Right.
Might be. I am going to invest in probably a quarter as well, so that you do get those highlights bloomed a bit more, and you can stack them as well, and they work in conjunction quite nicely, which is a nice little touch. If you really want an effect, you've then got 3/4 where it will go.
Yeah.
But that's actually how, in film in particular, it's a big deal on how you get that kind of film.
That kind of film noir look. And that's what I always think about, like the black and white with the massively bloomed out.
Absolutely.
Like,
and it's very easy to overdo it and for it to look incredibly unnatural. But if you just finesse it just right, wonderful. It's a great filter to have. And you can do it in post as well with a slightly different effect, I think. But you can do it in post.
So what are the different strengths that you get when it comes to that filter?
I think you can get 1/8, quarter, half, and a full.
Right.
Okay. I want to say stop, but I'm not sure that's actually what they call them. But they're the kind of levels that they do it in. Okay. So this is a 1/8 that I'm using right now.
Does that mean it makes my skin look super smooth?
It'll make my skin look super smooth, but I'm sorry, you're too far gone.
I'm weathered.
No, I'm joking.
Of course, if you are listening to the audio version of this podcast, then you're going to have to hop over to YouTube to check that out.
Yeah. I don't know if it will come across on YouTube as well, but perhaps after we're done today, we'll shoot just a few seconds without that filter on.
Oh, right, okay.
In exactly the same setup, and we can have a little side-by-side comparison.
Okay.
Yeah, that'd be nice.
Very nerdy, but...
Very nerdy.
Awesome.
But we're all good with nerds.
Yeah, so, I mean, in terms of filters, that's really the only filter I've looked into recently.
Yeah.
I do enjoy long exposure imagery. That, and I know a lot of people who use big stoppers, for example, 10 times ND or 10 stop ND filter. That sort of thing. You can get this really either smooth cloud movement or really smooth surfing the sea or something like that.
Yeah.
That could look cool if that's your thing.
And it's just a particular look, isn't it? Some of that stuff looks great. Some of it just looks so fake that it's like, I don't enjoy looking at it. Enjoy looking at it all that much. But if it's done just right in the right situation, looks fantastic.
Yeah,
looks fantastic. You can't go wrong with it.
Yeah, no, it always depends on what the main sort of focal point in the image is, like the main subject. Like I've seen some images recently where you had like a pier going out in the sea, and then there'd be almost like a little lighthouse at the end of it, like a little wooden tower sticking out of the sea.
Yeah,
and just by smoothing out the actual sea, and these were black and white shots as well. What happens is it draws all of your attention to that main subject. There's no distraction, and I do like that. That's
absolutely
that's that's really cool.
But that's a nice subtle use of it.
Exactly.
You get those where it's just so long that it's like, oh my God, is there any break in that water? And it's just, but again, it's just an effect, and it looks great. It can look really, really good.
Yeah. So filter's interesting thing. Not really something I've had to use, because I mean, typically for the kind of stuff that I do, I don't really need filters.
No, that's very true.
So apart from the standard UV filter, like the piece of glass you just basically put in front of your lens just to protect it, but then of course there's the argument as to why would you put a cheap piece of glass in front of your really expensive lens and blah blah blah. And I get all that. That's all good.
I don't use them.
I just use them out of habit. I think there's really no other reason. I think when I first got into photography, somebody said that was a good idea, and I believe them. I don't know. So I have UV filters for all of my lenses, and they're just permanently on there. I mean, I guess the advantage is that you don't get any dust.
Yeah, for sure.
Whatever, so
for sure.
But other than that, there's no real reason.
It's like the old GoPros, like my old Hero 5. It has a waterproof housing.
Oh yeah,
as part of it. It's part of the camera, but you can take the front lens cap off. And naively, when I first got it, I left that on. It's like, okay, it's part of the thing. I'm sure they've designed it in such a way that you shoot with it, and it is what it is. But then when you take that front off, you realise what an awful piece of plastic they put in front. It is not good. It looks horrendous. And as soon as you take it off, you've got the actual glass element there. And it's like, oh, there is a bit of clarity in it. Okay, great. Well, there you go. Cheap piece of plastic.
Yeah. Well, what else is new this week? Well, we've been on another Ferrari shoot.
Yeah.
So that was good.
Yeah, that was good fun. That was.
Yeah.
That was really good fun.
Yeah.
Really, really good fun. Bit of video, some cool photos.
Yeah.
And we still got a bit more to do on that one to get that ready.
Yeah, true. I mean, that was like a combination photo and video shoot, really. So part of it was we created an environmental portrait of the owner of the car and the car itself. And I think, the venue or the location was a workshop, for the lack of a better word.
Yep.
And so when we came in, and this is like one of these things where you don't really, because we didn't really, we had a few images just to get an idea, beforehand as to what the location was going to look like. But we hadn't seen the location before we rocked up to the
and it didn't look how I expected it to look, even from
exactly.
photos.
And this is one of these things where it does pay off to actually go and see the location before you actually shoot, but for a variety of reasons, it wasn't possible this time around. And it's a good indication as to what, sometimes you look at an image of something and you get an idea in your head, and then when you actually turn up, it turns out to be quite different.
Yeah.
And I didn't realize, because in the pictures it looked really quite clean, clean walls, and so I thought, I had an idea in my mind as to what we could do in that location. But then when we actually rocked up, it turns out there were loads of tools that you couldn't see in the original photos. But on one side of the workshop, there were lots of tools and like a workbench and tool drawers and all that kind of stuff. And a lot of it was covered in dust, and it looked quite kind of gritty and everything. And immediately the image in my head changed completely. So really, right there on the spot, I really changed what we were going to do in that on that location with this particular shoot, because all of a sudden we had all these props that we had access to. And so what I had originally intended to be almost like a luxury car shoot, turned into this, why don't we juxtapose this luxury car with some really gritty, dirty kind of mechanic type, and give it that sort of slightly dirtier look. And then we found an old dusty overall.
Yes, we did.
And that was hilarious. So I mean, so it went from originally being a well-dressed model, i.e. the owner of the car, in front of this expensive car, to why don't we just get him into this overall and make it look like, he's in this dusty old workshop, like working on this car.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it's an important thing for people to learn and realize that you can plan everything in advance of exactly what you're going to do, where you're going to be. But when you get there, you just need to be flexible enough to go, okay, actually, this is going to be better.
Yeah,
let's work that. And that, you just don't want to be too rigid. You want to be open to what the situation presents, right?
Exactly. I mean, I think the word better is exactly that is the point, because obviously it's a really good idea to have a preconceived plan in mind before you turn up, especially at the location. Especially because there's so many factors that come together. I mean, it's the owner of the car. The car was there. We had the workshop for a limited amount of time, so it wasn't like we could just happily shoot away.
Mm-hmm.
There were no time constraints or whatever. So all of these factors have to come together to create this shoot. But this wasn't a commercial shoot in the sense that we had, discussed the concept.
Yeah.
And, and the owner had signed, or, the owner of the car had signed off on that and all that. We just changed it right then and then. That was more of a thing like where we said like, okay, we're just going to, we've got this idea, we're going to create this image. It was more or less a test shoot. Right.
Mm-hmm.
And so, and then when we turned up and we saw all of these extra props there, we just came up with a better idea. And then, obviously we had to go and execute that, because it did actually make for a better picture. And to be honest, the final image that we came out with it just turned out to be so much better than what I had imagined from the start.
Exactly. And
we will see the image here.
If I remember to insert it when editing.
No, I will. I will send it over to you. Yeah, this is one of these times when it really pays off to be flexible.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, it wasn't exactly like, we turned up and we didn't know what to shoot, because I had, worked something out before. But again, it was just an opportunity that presented itself, really.
Yeah. And it's being confident enough to be able to change. Yeah. The reality is that technically how the shoot was done probably didn't change all that much. The technical aspects of it was probably very, very similar. Yeah. It was the scene that was going to be there, and being able to, that's 3/4 of the battle right there, is what the scene looks like, what the model's actually going to be doing, where the car's actually going to be positioned. Yeah. We ended up shooting the back of the car rather than the front, which would have been the original intention with for the portrait. Mm. And it's, it's then being, okay, how do we work this space? How do we make these items now work together?
Yeah. And I mean, again, we've spoken about this on this podcast in the past, but it's the set dressing at the beginning. What makes this photograph is the actual situation that you find the person in, the subject in, and the car. And so spending a lot of time dressing the set and getting the set right to look right is ultra important.
Yeah.
And so people are often surprised when they realize, well, actually the set dressing part took like 2 hours or 2.5 hours or whatever. The actual shoot only took 20 minutes.
Yeah.
It's because once you've got the set and all the little details in the place where you want it to be, and once you've got the lighting dialed in, then directing the subject, if you've got any experience in directing people, that in itself is relatively quick.
Yeah.
That's the thing. So in this particular case, I mean, that's literally what it was. It took like 2 hours, 2.5 hours to dress everything, get everything in place, move things around, try out a few things, light the whole thing, get Gary into the overall
without his slippers on. Yeah.
And and then the shooting portion of it was done relatively quickly.
Yeah, it was. Lighting was interesting on this one. It was a combination of flash and constant light, wasn't it?
Yeah, that was also just because
But that was again just a moment that had to be worked out on there and then. Yeah,
because the original intention was for it to be actually just a one light setup. And I had thought about packing another strobe, because I would normally have at least 2 or 3 lights in the car. But for some reason, on this particular day, I just forgot to pack them. So we literally...
There was a lot to think about what to get there for this particular shoot.
Yeah, so it was a lot of gear we took. But, in any event, it was so it started with the idea of it being a one light kind of setup. But we then thought, well, actually, there was a particular part of the car that I wanted to light separately. And so we had to combine it with some constant light. And then, of course, photographically, a number of things changed. First of all, your shutter speed has to change dramatically, because this is the major difference between shooting with constant light as opposed to strobes, is that with constant light, you're shooting at a much, much, much lower shutter speed. To the point where, and this is only my personal opinion, and I know there are lots of photographers out there who like shooting people with constant light and all the rest of it. But you really, with constant light, you have 2 options. Either you crank the ISO or you lower the shutter speed. That's basically it. Or you shoot so wide open, But in this particular case, the situation was, the scene was relatively deep. So you're limited in terms of aperture. There was a human in the picture, so you had to contend with some movements. It wasn't like shooting still life. And although we were on a tripod, so there's something you can do with the shutter speed, but you can't go too crazy. And
what did you settle on in the end? 100?
It was actually around about 100, 80 or 100, something like that. And then, you can balance that with the strobe. That's all cool, but you have to really look at the constant light part of it, because if your shutter speed is too high, then you're not going to really see very much of that. If it's too low, then you're going to run into a problem with your model and movement. And if you crank your ISO up too high, then you get a problem with noise in the image. And because it was a fairly large scene that was also very busy, you kind of want to try and keep the noise to a minimum if you can. So, which is why normally I would always light a scene like that with strobes, with no question, because then I can control all these things and I can have them where I want them to be. However, in this particular case, we had to kind of balance it off, but it did work out quite well. I mean, the constant light, essentially what we did was we focused a constant light on the engine part of the engine hood, which in this particular Ferrari is obviously the back of the car. But I just wanted to get a little bit of light on that, just to get a tiny little bit more detail in there.
And that had, and that was using there was a reflector on the front of it, and this was using the 300D.
Yeah,
and that was maxed out.
Yeah, it was a full power. I mean, but just goes to show how, how much more powerful the strobe is when it comes to lighting a scene.
And the thing is, it was bright in that room too, so that none of this helps. And I've looked back at some of the footage since, and because of the window or the lights kind of that were in the ceiling, there was nothing we could do about that, and we just had to work with it.
Yeah.
Some of you can see when it's going cloudy and sunny, and the exposure is changing hugely on a lot of that. So that's going to be fun to contend with.
And that is again, that's one of the reasons why I prefer to shoot with strobes, because I can just cut all of that environmental light out completely, and just then control it.
And if you're in the studio, that's a lot simpler to do, isn't it? If you're using constant, but
except for my studio where I have this annoying skylight. It's just really so idiotic, this thing.
Oh dear, yeah.
But, it seemed like a good idea when we built that, but
yeah.
Lessons learned. Yeah, absolutely. Well, I'm gonna have to find a more permanent.
But it's a multi-purpose space as well at the same time. So
correct. Yeah, absolutely.
There's got to be compromise.
Oh, and generally speaking, the light in there is really nice.
Mm-hmm.
Because you got one wall which is essentially glass, glass French doors, and then the skylight over the top of it, and then a north-facing window. So the light as it is in this space is actually really nice. So if you want to do, top-down kind of product shoots or whatever, you can actually do that with window light in there, because it's perfect for that. And any time between, let's say, September and March, you don't really have a problem with the skylight because over here in the UK, the sky is usually overcast, and you'll never have any issues. But in the summertime, so late spring and summer, the sun is higher up in the sky, and then you get really harsh light coming through the skylight, and that's when you have to start blocking it off.
Yeah.
So at the moment, I have because I haven't found a blackout blind for that skylight yet. I've made this contraption out of poster board, which sits on the roof.
That's the trick, though, isn't it?
That's the trick, yeah. So it's a little bit of a pain, but hey.
Yeah, well, that needs must.
That's the DIY part of it.
Yeah.
So,
yeah.
But yeah, so that was a cool shoot.
Good shoot.
The video part of it, we can talk about a little bit.
Yeah, that was interesting to do that. Because we've gone in thinking that we want to do a cinematic style sequence for this particular car, and obviously we only had the opportunity for it to be stationary on this particular day.
True.
And so that involved a lot of close-up shots, almost exclusively filmed at 120 frames. So it's lovely slow-mo if we want it, can speed it up if we want that to. So there's an awful lot of close-ups. I had an issue, though, which I wasn't anticipating quite, and that was focusing. And now this might partly be with the 35mm lens that I was using. Yeah. Because it's a macro lens. It does, every so often, it has a bit of an issue focusing. And if it was on a different lens, I think it would have been slightly better. Okay. But generally, it had a lot of issues focusing on the red, shiny paint.
Okay.
And, there's zero contrast there. There's nothing going on. Yeah. But as soon as you got a detail popping in, it started to go, okay, right, I can focus. Yeah. And it pulled in and it was fine. But it was a pain. And it also, when you're at 120 frames as well, it takes longer to focus, autofocus. If you're down at 25 or whatever, fine. It's a lot quicker.
So Canon have introduced eye focus and animal eye focus, and I think bird's eye focus.
Yeah.
So what we need now is Ferrari focus.
Ferrari focus. Yeah. Come on, Canon.
Car paint
Get
focus.
Get your game together.
Terrible.
Car paint focus.
That's it.
So, yeah. It was good, though. There was one moment which was hazardous to my health.
Yeah.
And it was just at the end, we decided to just get a quick moving away shot from behind, right? And that meant starting the car up because we wanted to get the exhaust moving and the lights coming on and then moving away. So I was, 30 on the 35, so it's probably 3 foot behind the car, something like that, 4 foot, 5 foot, I don't know, something like that. And so I was shooting there. The car started up, and do you know what happened to me?
Your ears got blown off.
Well, aside from that, do you know what happened? I got all of the air from the exhaust shooting straight into my face.
Oh, no.
And fuel spitting on me as well. Yeah, that was fun. That was fun.
Yeah.
Yeah. I won't do that again quite
that. I mean, the other thing I completely neglected to think about was really just the noise that engine makes. I mean, that's
relentless.
In that enclosed space as well. It felt even louder. Yeah. So, I mean, it sounds cool, but it does blow your brains out, really.
Yeah, it really does. It really does. So left to do on that really is I definitely want to get an afternoon with him again, just to shoot a few more out and about scenes.
Yeah.
Nothing drastic, just a handful of shots that all work to add in. Yeah.
But from a storyline point of view, I think the thing that was really quite interesting about this particular video project was that it was almost like an origin story of how he came to own this car, which is quite interesting, and the reasons behind it, which kind of just adds a little bit more dimension to the whole thing, because it's the human story behind the car in a way. So I found that was a good lesson.
Yeah, it was, and he talks about his dad a lot in it as well, and so when we do go out and get some shots, I want to get some shots with his dad too, just a little bit, just to add to the story. But unfortunately, none of that was possible on the day.
Yeah,
that's okay. We'll just shoot again.
Yeah,
I'm all right shooting. Always all right shooting a Ferrari.
That's very true. Yeah, it was good fun for sure. So that was last week's event.
Yeah, that was fun.
Yeah, it was cool.
It was fun.
And other than that, I'm out for a week.
Yeah.
Off to Hollybobs. There you go.
Lazy.
Exactly.
Lazy. And I'm stuck here editing. Thank you.
You're welcome. Now there have been some really interesting stories in the world of photography news this week that I've come across, which I thought we should probably cut into.
Let's do it.
The first one I kind of thought will sort of affect you directly, because it's a story about Amazon deliveries gone wrong.
There's a story every other day about Amazon. No, I'm kidding.
So in this particular story, a couple from Colorado, wedding photographers, spent $7,000 on a brand new Sony Alpha 1. Now, the package arrived only for them to realize that it contained nothing but empty boxes. And after getting in touch with the Amazon customer service, they were told that there was nothing else that could be done and they were going to be disconnected. So they were refused a refund, emailed Mr. Bezos directly, and only after that they managed to get a refund. Now, that in itself is, I mean, of course, that's questionable customer service, first of all.
Yeah.
But
shocking customer service.
the fact that the fact that you would get, or that you would receive an empty box, would suggest that potentially somebody would have nicked your gear.
Yeah,
somewhere in transit.
Yeah.
Is that something that happens a lot with Amazon? Or?
Well, I should probably clarify. So I used to work for Amazon.
That's
for
precisely what we're talking about.
For a very long time, 15 years I worked for them, and nearly all of that time as part of transaction risk, which is in layman's terms fraud prevention. So all of this stuff actually came through our department all the time, stuff like this. So it doesn't happen a lot, no. But the trouble is, and you can never know, I can't really say much on it because every situation is very, very different. There's, if you imagine how many touch points there are, stuff like this could happen anywhere.
I mean, somebody could just basically take a photo of an empty box and then claim it was empty. It could be. I'm not saying that's what happened in this case, but I mean, theoretically, it's possible.
Absolutely, of course, it's possible. Anything is possible if you think about it. It could, from the person receiving the item, could have done exactly what you just said. The delivery driver somewhere in the delivery hub. Maybe it wasn't delivered by Amazon, maybe it went by DHL or Royal Mail or any other one that they're currently using. Something could have happened in prior to the item even arriving at Amazon, and it. Who knows? There's so many touch points. What is really shocking, but this stuff happens with any company.
But no, it's true.
It gets widely reported because Amazon are Amazon, and they take more orders than God. I can't think how many tens or hundreds of times more orders than any other company they take. So these issues will happen more often. It's just numbers, right? It's just stuff like this, how it works. But what really shocked me more about this story is that from what we heard, that they were simply just refused a refund by customer service. Or any further investigation into actually what has gone on here. And Amazon pride themselves on customer service. So again, these things happen with CS all the time with everybody. So it could simply be a new agent. It could be someone who didn't really understand the situation well enough and made a quick decision where they shouldn't have done. Who knows? It could have also have gone through their entire escalation process there and they've been refused the order. We don't know. We're hearing one side of the story. So we don't know that actually they may have gone through all of this process and still deemed that actually, I'm sorry, nothing has gone wrong here because for want of a better phrase, we don't believe you.
So the thing there that really, sparked my interest was the fact that they then emailed Mr. Bezos himself.
Yeah.
Is that a common thing? I mean, because after that email,
Yeah.
apparently things started moving. They were eventually able to get a refund. So is that like a common thing that people email him?
Happens happens all the time.
Really? Okay.
Yeah, happens all the time. And I'll mention a bit more about this because it's widely reported everywhere about it anyway.
Does he have like a particular PA that just picks up these kind of emails, or does he actually read
no,
those?
He does it himself.
Oh, really? Okay.
Yeah. And if he, and he'll send it out, and if he will say something if he truly thinks this doesn't feel right at all, I want this really looked into, and he'll make sure that it's really looked into. Equally, if he said, "What, just please handle this," and it'll go down. So where it's this type of issue that also came through my area at the time as well, and they're called Jeff escalations.
Oh, really?
Simple as that. That's all they are. And it's expected that this is looked into in great detail and a full report sent back to him as to what happened, what went wrong, what the result is, and if there was an error on Amazon's part, how it's going to tell us exactly how it's not going to happen again.
Right. Okay.
And put something in place and underway right away to correct it. He takes this stuff very, very seriously.
Well, it's interesting to see, to hear that from like somebody on the inside, really, because I think it's easy to get into the kind of Amazon bashing type of game, because that's one of the things you hear all the time. But of course, nobody really knows what's actually going on behind the scenes.
No.
So that's quite cool. Personally, I've never really had a problem with Amazon deliveries at all. I've had issues with other deliveries in the past, but
I have to say, I don't think I've had a couple, but then I've ordered, I don't know how many thousands of orders I've placed on Amazon over the years, but a couple have gone, I've had a couple of issues.
As an ex-employee, do you get free delivery?
No.
Or Prime for life or something?
No,
oh, man,
no, you don't.
What?
No, you don't. You don't get any of that. You get a small employee discount of, it ranges between 5 and 10%.
Right.
And it's only so much a year. And the reason it's so low is because the margin on every item is so tiny anyway that that's all there is. Yeah. That's all the space there is. That's why Amazon, it's because Amazon prices are so generally so much cheaper than anywhere else.
Yeah. Well, I mean, there was another case actually, which is sort of goes along, to the same sort of lines. There's a very well-known YouTuber who reportedly bought a Canon 1DX and then opened the box and found a box full of rocks initially, then managed to, organize a resend or like a refund or whatever, and they send him another box which then contained bricks. So how does that happen? That's like, you kind of go, well, okay, if you get a box with rocks or bricks, then somebody must have put that stuff in there deliberately.
Yeah.
Somewhere along the line.
This stuff happens, and Amazon get targeted for stuff like this because they're so customer centric, if you like. They will always refund people. They just always have. They've always been like, if you've ever contacted them for a refund or a return, it's almost no quibble, right?
I've never had a problem with refunds ever, actually.
Yeah. And they've always done that. So, in general, when I've heard of this stuff happening before, I'm trying to choose my words carefully here. In general, when I've heard of this stuff before, it's the person who's said that they've received that who's done it.
Right. Okay. So that's that's a genuine case of fraud, then, though.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. Stuff like that's in there. Yeah.
And I'm sure that happens.
There's many different ways and places that could happen. Someone returning something and trying to make it the same weight because they'll know that Amazon will weigh the package to make sure that it's, and it just wasn't checked as thorough. That one particular item didn't get checked quite as thoroughly when it came back. It could easily be that, and then it's gone back out in error. Yeah, that could have happened.
But this I think what people tend to forget in this is that there are so many people in that whole supply chain,
right?
That human error can. I mean, it's just likely to happen
Absolutely.
all along the way at
Absolutely.
some point. So and with an operation as large as Amazon, there's just a chance of especially human error creeping in just generally is much higher than if you're looking at a much smaller operation.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
That's
That's what I mean. The Amazon are probably taking 1,000 times more orders than the next closest competitor
for sure,
every minute.
Especially over the last year or so.
Especially over the last year.
If I just think about my own behavior and like how many Amazon deliveries we've had over the last 14 months or something. It's been nuts.
Do you know what the scary thing is? Haven't been earning for a year, basically. Yeah, I've spent more in the last year.
Well,
just because I've been at home, it's like, a little bit of shopping. All right. I'll just get that. I'll just get that. Yeah, that's fine.
Well, we've been quite good, actually. I think, generally speaking, we've also managed to kind of get rid of a lot of, overheads. Like, we got rid of one car, for example, and changed stuff over. So that's definitely made a dent on our monthly outgoings from here on in. And because we're not changing back to owning 2 cars anytime soon, that'll be a cost saving that's going to carry on. So that's definitely made an impact. So yeah, and the other funny story I came across was the story of this Liverpool-based drug dealer, right?
It's always got to be good if drug dealers mentioned in it and someone from Liverpool.
So get this right. So this guy took a picture of some Stilton cheese, which if you're not from the UK, Stilton cheese is like a blue cheese. It's like a moldy kind of a cheese, right? It's very smelly.
Yeah.
And some people love it. Personally, I'm like,
okay, you need to sort your taste buds out.
Yeah,
it's fantastic.
It's not my favorite cheese. I like it in like a sauce almost.
Yeah, yeah. Put over your steak.
Yeah, over your steak. Yeah, exactly right. Absolutely, totally perfect.
I love blue cheese until it gets so strong that you can actually taste the mold as mold.
Right. Well,
and then it's like, that's a bit furry.
I think I draw the line right there.
Yeah, can't be doing that.
But so anyway, so he took a photo of himself holding this block of Stilton cheese. So all you can see is the cheese and his hand holding it in the photo, right? And he put this on this social media platform, the social platform called EncroChat, which I've never actually heard of. It's like a Europe-wide social platform, right?
Okay.
But the UK police have caught on to this particular platform because, as it turns out, and maybe this has something to do with like end-to-end encryption, or I don't really know. But apparently, it turns out that organized crime have used this platform to plan criminal activities, right? And so the UK police had infiltrated this platform, and they found this photo. And from the photo itself, they managed to analyze the fingerprints, and that way managed to identify this dude and track him down.
Amazing.
And arrest him. So how amazing is that?
That's great. The fact that, that just from let's call it an iPhone photo, that's being compressed and sent over social, that they can still pull enough, just pull enough detail, full stop.
Oh, yeah.
But to then pull it off an impression that's on cheese packaging.
Yeah, sure.
It's just amazing.
You can see his fingertips in it. That's the
sorry, it's pulled off his fingers himself. I see.
But the thing is how unfortunate for the criminal as well, that his love for cheese should have ended him in jail. It's
amazing.
Like, what? But I found that was quite remarkable. It's not the first time, I guess, that a photograph has led to somebody's prosecution. But it's certainly the first time I've heard of police identifying fingerprints.
Certainly, that's been reported like that. It's very CSI, isn't it?
Yeah, it is very CSI. We should talk to Banger about this.
We should.
Yeah,
I was just thinking the same.
That is so. If you're new to this podcast, some months ago we had a guest on the show, Banger, who is a real life CSI.
Yeah.
Crime scene photographer.
And he's been doing it for a long time as well, hasn't he?
Absolutely. So that'll be so if you're interested in that kind of topic right there, head back and check out that episode because that's really interesting. But yeah, so that was another story. What else in the photography news this week then?
Well, we spoke about Amazon. They're based in Seattle, right? There
Yes.
was another Seattle story, wasn't there? Where a street photographer was out just minding his own business, taking photos, but started to take a photo but took a photo of a woman who was walking down the street, basically, or in the park or wherever it was.
She was riding her scooter, I think.
Oh, that's right. Yes,
Yeah.
riding a scooter. Yeah. And she was very unhappy about this and started shouting and all sorts at him to delete it. And he explained, "Hey, I'm a street photographer. This is what I do." And that's that. But he said, "Okay, I'm sorry if you're not happy about this, I'll delete it." So he went ahead and deleted the photo. Right.
Yeah, and she was filming him on her phone at the same time. So this is like a typical thing, of course, where people feel like they're being wronged or something, and then start filming the whole scene on their mobile phone. So she was very unhappy about him taking photos. I think what came into it was that she's a 19-year-old girl/woman. The guy himself, the photographer in question, was in his 50s or 60s potentially, and so she basically thought it was creepy that there'd be a guy with a big lens taking photos of her. Well, in a public space.
Yeah.
So that was the other thing. So she filmed the whole scene on her mobile phone, and he on camera showed her the photos that he'd taken on the back of his camera, and then deleted them. But what happened next was the thing where I thought, like, whoa, hang on a second.
Yeah, quite.
So she then took that video and put it on TikTok, for her 200 and I don't know, just over 200,000 followers to see. But then she also shared it with a local Seattle-based local TikTok account, which added another 250, 300,000 whatever followers to it. So basically, she had a problem with him taking her photo in a public space, which is completely.
So to the best of our knowledge right now in the US, if you're in a public space, you can take photos.
Yeah.
Right.
Absolutely.
So it's not being in any kind of creepy way, just taking photos of someone like that. So you're a street photographer.
Yeah.
90% of your subjects in there are going to be people.
Yeah.
Right? So it's kind of the point.
And I mean, the legal justification of that is actually exactly the same over here in the UK. And that's basically the assumption that if you're in a public space and you put yourself into a public space, then you don't have a reasonable expectation of privacy.
Yeah.
And in a sense, I mean, that makes perfect sense. If you decide to go out into a public street or something, then you can't reasonably expect to maintain your own privacy, right? Because, well, you've just put yourself into a public space. So therefore, if you're a photographer, you can take photos in a public space. No problem. There's a caveat to that because, for instance, there was a case fairly recently over the last few years, or last year, I think, where a photographer took images of women's boobs and behinds. That went to court, and the court had to also throw that out because these were taken in a public space. However, there is there's a sort of limitation on that nowadays, I think, where it comes to obscene imagery and whatever else. So
that crosses the line.
Yeah, I mean, that crosses the line, and that's all cool. But I think none of that was the case in this case in Seattle, because he was literally just taking a picture of of a 19-year-old woman riding a scooter, and lots of other people who were there, by the way. This wasn't, he wasn't just taking pictures of her. So he didn't follow her around or harass her or anything like that. He was just, sat in this spot taking pictures of people walking past and probably the scenery or whatever else. So anyway, she had a problem with that. She filmed the whole thing and then put it on TikTok. But so my issue with that is well, what a double standard. That's just how, it's you don't want somebody to take pictures of you, but then you don't have a problem with filming that person and putting it onto your TikTok when you've actually gotten him to delete his images in the first place.
And not only putting the video up, but tagged it or annotated on it, whatever you want to call it,
Yeah.
as calling him a creep.
Oh yeah, exactly. So that's where I started to have a real problem with it. In street photography, just generally, when you're out there with your camera, you take pictures of people in the street. Some people will have an issue with that. That's fine. Usually, and there may be no legal justification for that, as in like, you're in a public space, you're perfectly, legally, you're perfectly allowed, and you're fine taking those pictures. But of course, you don't want to offend anybody. So
No.
if somebody comes up to you and you show them the pictures and they still want you to delete them and you delete them, then I think it's case closed and it's
I
all
agree.
good, right? Everybody should be happy. But this just took it this extra step further. And that's where I started to have a problem with it.
I agree.
You know,
it's wrong. It's wrong to be like, you can be upset and you do exactly what you just said. Ask him to delete it or look at it. And they go, oh, actually, it's really good. Can you send it to me? Yeah.
Well, exactly. Absolutely. Yeah, that's it. And there have been occasions in the past where, I've ended up, people asked me what I was doing. I showed them the photos, there'd be conversation, and afterwards, I would say like, here's my card. If you want to give me your email address, or email me, and I'm super happy to send you a copy of the photo. No problem at all. That's worked on occasion. So, as long as, because when you go out to photograph, you don't go out to offend people.
No.
And
you just want a good shot.
Absolutely.
That's
yeah. There's a reason for why there needs to be some freedom in my mind when it comes to taking photographs of people in public spaces, and we can go into freedom of press and the freedom of reporting and stuff like that. All of that's really part of that whole discussion, because I think we need to be able to have an independent press, and the press needs to have freedom to report, especially in public. We're not talking about taking photos of people on public land, on private land, or in their private dwelling. That's a whole different thing. I mean, in the UK, actually, the law is such that if you are in a public space, let's say you stand on the street, and you can see into somebody's living room through their window, you're actually legally allowed to take pictures of people in their living room when you yourself are in a public space. And that's a much more of a contentious kind of thing.
I mean, you can question the morality of that to the death, but the law is
what it is, and we can agree with that or not. That's a different thing. But I mean, there is a caveat again. If you are climbing a tree in order to get access and get a line of view into somebody's living room, that's illegal. Yeah. So there are some limitations to that. But if you just stood in a street, on a sidewalk, on a public street, and you can see into somebody's living room on the, what we call the ground floor here, and elsewhere it's known as the first floor, but that's a whole different issue. Then you're legally allowed to do that, and there we are. It's one of these things. That's like that's kind of the gray area in terms of morality. Yeah. But again, just coming back to this thing in Seattle. I mean, I'm just not cool with, on one hand, people, wanting to maintain their privacy, but at the same time, they're putting your whole life onto social media. So it's like, well, what's your privacy concern with that? Because all of a sudden you don't seem to have one anymore. Yeah. You know what I mean? It's weird.
And I guess, just slightly defend her a little bit. We don't know if anything else happened prior to that video starting. Maybe there might have been more conversation going on. He may have refused, may have this until she started filming, and then he could, oh right, I better. Well, who knows? You don't know. But we're only going by what was on that 30-second video. What was there? But based on that, no, I'm not on board with it. At all.
That's it. So anyway, so let us know what you think about this particular issue. It'd be really interesting to hear from you. Send us a DM or send us an email. I'd be interested to see what our listeners, stroke viewers, think about this particular case. Cool. Now, we also thought about something else today because we were discussing a number of things the other day where we thought about, so the 10 most commonly made mistakes that especially beginner photographers make. And so we came up with a little list of different things that we think are like the top 10 most commonly made mistakes.
Yeah.
When people get into photography in the first place.
Just real quick aside, I didn't realize you were a doctor.
Am I?
Yeah.
What's that?
The state of your handwriting.
Oh,
that's doctor's handwriting.
Oh my God. My handwriting. Oh my God. I tell you what, my handwriting's gone so down the drain ever since I first laid hand onto a computer keyboard.
Yeah. So
that's
exactly. So
like,
I only say it because mine's worse, probably.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, my handwriting has deteriorated. I've actually, this is really why I use ink usually to write, because it slows me down.
Mm-hmm.
And my handwriting is considerably better since I started using, ink pens. But yeah, that's definitely.
Yeah.
But
all I'm saying is I can't read any of that.
Oh, my kids' handwriting's even worse. So
really?
Yeah, of course, because they grew up, using keyboards.
Yeah, true.
And
true.
touch screens and whatever.
True.
So yeah. So anyway, 10. So what's our number one tip? Do you think, or the number one mistake that people make when they first get into photography?
Well, it would help if I could read on notes, but I really can't read that. I honestly cannot read a word that's written there.
Okay, so I'll help you out with that then. So I think the number one thing that people still can't read. It just says hello. So one of the things that I often find that when I speak to people who just get into photography is that there's almost like an unhealthy fixation on gear.
Yes. Okay. Oh, is that what that says? Okay. Gear. Yeah. Okay.
So yeah, that's I find that's a very typical thing. People tend to be concerned about which lens to use or which camera body to buy, or whichever piece of gear they might feel that they need to create better images or to get better at photography.
And that's simple when you're starting, is forget about it. Ignore it.
It's a difficult thing to realize, I think, and to really get on board with when you're first starting out, because you always think like, well, clearly that other photographers' images are better because they have a better camera or a better lens.
You won't appreciate any of the advantages of having a more expensive camera, quote unquote, until you're better at photography in general. You won't appreciate what that's really doing for you, because you're not creating images in the best possible way yet. The simple way I think of it is, if you can get a great photo with a, again, quote unquote, rubbish camera, cheap camera, whatever you want to call that, you're going to get a stunning photo with a more expensive camera.
Well, although in my case, it actually it went exactly the opposite way. So when I remember buying my first DSLR, and my photography went downhill very rapidly because I just wasn't able to make use of that camera. And
okay,
the thing there was that I really didn't understand a lot of the sort of basics at that point. I remember I had really no idea about aperture, or the effect that ISO has on your image, and all of a sudden you're going like, oh, okay. Because the thing is, the reality is, when you have your camera on auto, or in auto mode, it doesn't really matter very much as to which camera you're using, because your end result is always going to be pretty much the same, and so I found that, with my first DSLR, initially my images were considerably worse than images I took just with my phone at the time,
okay,
or with a considerably cheaper camera. Because I remember I had like a Canon point and shoot there. I said it. I used to have a Canon, and and those images were okay. Actually, they were perfectly well exposed. I didn't make any decisions in taking the photo. I would have pointed it at something and pressed a button, and the camera did everything else. And then I remember like getting my first DSLR thinking, okay, surely the same must be the case. But as soon as you move out of auto, you find yourself in front of a whole lot of problems, really, and that's really where sort of basic knowledge of photography really comes in handy. And I find this today. I have like a second body that I use, but that I don't use it very often nowadays. But it's the second body that I have in my bag pretty much all the time, just as a backup. It's an APS-C sensor body, so it's a much cheaper camera, but it fits the same lenses. Or you can use the same lenses on there, so it's a good alternative just in case something goes wrong with my main body. But it's in for the lack of a better term, it's kind of a much lower quality amateur grade type of camera. But I guarantee you, I can get the same quality of images out of that.
Yep.
Out of that thing, because actually the sensor is okay in it. And it's all about how you use the gear that you have. So I think in the beginning, it's easy to get sidetracked by focusing on gear rather than focusing on actually getting better at photography.
Absolutely.
And that new lens, that new 1.4 or 1.2
forget it.
Prime lens isn't going to do that for you.
Exactly.
Exactly.
I went through a very staged learning process with camera settings, let's say, and that was, start in auto, in program, whatever it's called, on the whatever camera you actually have, and just shoot with it. Focus on your composition. Focus on how you frame whatever it is you're taking a photo of. Focus on where light is coming from. Don't worry about flash and things like that yet. Just use natural light. Just start using the camera and keep your hands on it all the time, so you get used to having this what feels quite alien at first thing in your hand. And once you've done that for a while and you're finding that feeling a bit more natural, I moved out of auto and then into aperture priority with ISO set to auto.
Yeah.
So the only thing that I was changing was the aperture, so I could learn what aperture does and how that affects the image that I'm looking at. So, we won't go into what aperture, there's no need to go into all of that right now, but that's what I did. Then I would switch to shutter priority and do exactly the same thing and learn how shutter affected the image. And, everything else was taking care of itself because everything else was auto. And then move ISO out of auto and go back to aperture priority and shutter priority and start manipulating both. Now I understood what they were doing and see how ISO would affect that image. And then I take all that off and then move to manual and start trying to put it all together in my own head and start working out how to do what I needed to do for the particular shot that I was trying to take. And that's kind of the stepped process I went through to try and learn all those your primary settings on the camera.
Because the thing that comes in there is that basic definition of what makes a better photo. Because generally speaking, you can kind of break photography up into two basic elements. You've got the technical element.
Yep.
That's all. The choice of aperture, the choice of shutter speed, all that kind of stuff, all the technical kind of thing. And then you've got the creative part. And so, if you, for instance, if you take composition, for example, like how you place things in the frame, back composition is back composition. It doesn't really matter. You can use the correct aperture on that or not. It doesn't matter because it's still a bad photo, as in the composition is still bad.
Yeah.
So the technical element of it, this is what I always try and bring across, is the fact that, mastering the technical component of photography is actually that's a given for any photographer. That's just a given. Like, we're using a tool, it's a bit like a carpenter learning how to use a hammer. When you compare different carpenters, it's kind of a given that they know how to use the tools.
Right.
We're not even going to really talk about that very much, because you hire a carpenter, you sort of just expect them to be able to use the tools. What you actually hire, or furniture maker, let's say, what you're really looking at when you're comparing these two different furniture makers, for instance, is their creative skill of building a particular style of furniture that you might like over somebody else. Like, you're not questioning a painter in like, do they know how to use a paintbrush? That's like base level. That's a given, And it's the same thing with photography. the technical part is extremely important because it allows you to create the kind of image that you have in your mind.
Exactly.
But, just being in control of the technical part of it doesn't make you a better photographer than somebody else, because again, that's just a given. So, when people talk about like wrong camera settings, for example, it's just a thing where I always think like, well, is there really there isn't really such a thing as a wrong camera setting. It just means that, it's only a wrong camera setting if you're not getting the result that you had in your mind's eye. Because, like, let's say for argument's sake, let's say you have this thing in your head where you want like a really soft background, and a focus on your subject, but you want to make sure that your background is really nice and soft. Well, if you use the wrong aperture for that, then you're not going to get that. So that's an example of wrong camera setting. But one person might want to have the background in focus and therefore chooses f11 or whatever, and another person doesn't want that. Another photographer doesn't want the background in focus and therefore uses 2.8 or 1.8 or whatever. And so it's not a matter of, well, f11 is the wrong camera setting to use in this case. It's just your creative idea is based on your technical knowledge of.
And that's quite a distinction, isn't it? Is choosing settings based on a creative idea, or just choosing the wrong setting to change. So, you might have your shutter speed at 1/5000th, right?
Yeah.
But you're cranking your ISO to compensate for that, to get a good exposure. Well, actually, don't introduce a ton of noise and put your ISO up at 5,000 as well. Bring that right down, bring your shutter speed right down, and balance it that way so that your noise goes away or drastically reduced, and you'll still freeze in motion provided you don't go too far.
Yeah. And, again, it's the situation that you're in will dictate pretty much what you can and can't do, and how you have to set up, how you have to control your tool or your camera. Like, you're talking about high shutter speeds, for instance. The bit that we shot a few episodes ago, out on the moor, is a really good example for that, because the idea there was really, to really control the background or the sky and expose for the sky, and so the shutter speed had to go higher. So in this particular situation, just taking a portrait of you, wouldn't not ordinarily require a shutter speed of 1250 or whatever it was at the time. But in the scenario that we were in, given what we wanted to achieve creatively, i.e., we wanted to get exposed for the background, get these really nice colors in the sky, and then exposing you correctly in the foreground, that required technical knowledge.
Yeah.
And so that required higher shutter speed, and we knew we had to get extra value through scroll. So that's what I mean. It's it very much comes down to what you want to achieve creatively.
That's it. And they're probably shots that I wouldn't anticipate a beginner attempting to try just yet. But it's stuff people should aspire to, so they can grow their knowledge to go, okay, so why is that shutter speed so high? That's the type of thing you'll be thinking in the early days. Go, it doesn't make any sense why this. And over time, because you'll get so used to what those different functions do, you'll start to appreciate why. Yeah. And it's the important bit.
And the why is always the important question, actually. That's the question that you should always ask, is the why. That's the first question you got to come to. I have this very often with events, especially outdoor events. When I compare the way that I use my settings on my camera to other photographers, 9 times out of 10, I find that when I compare my settings to others, you'd find that a lot of people would use aperture priority in those sort of situations, especially for event photography, for example. I don't like aperture priority. I prefer shutter speed priority. And the reason, for me personally, I prefer it because creatively, when I shoot, especially a music event, and especially when it's an outdoors event where, unfortunately, in this country, the light changes all the time, because unless you're in a place where you have clear blue skies for most of the time, which I guess if you live in like a place like Arizona or something, that's the case. But over here in the UK, our skies are very often overcast, or there's like a very rapidly changing mixture of sun and clouds. So you have basically clouds in the sky. 1 minute you have a lot of sunshine, and then literally the next second, a cloud moves in front of the sun, and it changes the lighting conditions dramatically.
Yeah.
So aperture priority seems like a really good idea in this particular case, except from my perspective, when I'm shooting a music event, I want to be in control of the shutter speed because I want to make sure that I get the amount of movement in, let's say, the guitarist's hands or something, where I want it to be. So
Yeah.
and it may be that I want to freeze the movement, or it may be that I want to display some movement in there. So I want to be able to control my shutter speed. So if I'm leaving it in aperture priority, I have no control over the shutter speed.
Yeah.
But if I'm leaving it in shutter speed priority, I do. So, and the camera takes care of all the rest of it. And because the lighting conditions are changing so rapidly, I can then really just focus on what I want to achieve creatively and let the computer take over, right? So the majority of event photographers would basically swear by aperture priority in a similar situation. But because I have a creative idea as to and displaying this movement is important to me as a former musician, or as not a former musician, as a musician. I have a different agenda when I take these images. So therefore, I choose a different function of functionality on my camera. So again, the thing about wrong camera settings is it's always like a thing where you go, well, it's pretty hard to say that something's wrong. It just depends on where you're coming from.
Yeah.
Anyway, so moving on to the next tip. I've got a few more in the back for you. Like shooting RAW rather than JPEG. Oh my God. What, I mean, okay, actually, well, we have to explore that a little bit.
It's difficult, isn't it? There's a lot of sense in JPEG in the early days, I think, because RAW does require editing. You need to do something with that, and you may not yet be comfortable doing that, and that's cool.
Yeah,
that's cool.
Totally cool.
You're trying to get your head around your camera and taking the photos. It might be at this stage, depending on who you are, it might just be a step too far to try and work your head out how to go around editing, even just basic editing. So JPEG actually might make sense because you can bake in a particular profile that you can set within your camera. However, there will be a point where the photos will not look how you want them to look at all, because the profiles are just very specific profiles, and that's when you definitely need to shift to RAW. I don't. It might be easier for you to explain what RAW actually is. What's the difference between RAW and JPEG?
In a nutshell, really, when you take a RAW image, what actually happens is the camera records a much wider dynamic range. So what it means is that you get a lot more detail, or you can pull a lot more detail out of the shadows, for example, and you can pull your highlights back by a large degree as well. So you, in the editing process, you have a lot more control over the way you want something to look. So, for instance, you take a picture and there's some really dark shadows in there. It looks like they're black, but really, when you then start to pull that back in Lightroom, for example, or in Capture One, you realize that there's a lot more information still hidden in these shadows, and you can get a lot more detail back. And that means you have a lot more capability of controlling the way you want that image to look. And the same thing is true for the colors and everything else. So a raw image, when you first import it into the computer, actually might look really rather flat. But you can have to bring all that contrast back in post. And again, it gives you great flexibility. It allows you to shoot in certain situations, knowing that you're going to be able to get something back in post. And concept photography is a really good example, because that's how I shoot. I always shoot at least stop underexposed. And there's something called protecting the highlights, where you make sure that you don't blow out the highlights, and therefore you underexpose, knowing that in post you'll get that detail back in the shadows. So you already know, you basically shoot the photo knowing how much you can get back in post-production. And so it's like this balancing act, because between taking the photo on camera, and then the post-production process, and in combination that will give you the end result. And I always compare it to electric guitars, because an electric guitar on its own without an amplifier will sound very quiet and dead, and won't sound very, very musical. But an amp on its own makes no noise whatsoever. It's just a box, right, with a speaker. When you put the two together, that's when it starts to sound great. And the same thing is really true for digital photography, in a way, where you have, the camera on one hand, that's like your electric guitar, and you've got the amp on the other hand. Photoshop doesn't actually do anything by itself, but once you put the two together, that's when the magic happens. And so, of course, then that requires you to know how to edit and how to use Photoshop and Lightroom and all the rest of it. The great thing about digital cameras nowadays is that you can shoot JPEG and RAW at the same time. And so, for instance, to give you an example, when I go out with my little Fuji X100 series camera, Fuji have some really nice picture profiles. What that means is basically they sort of almost like pre-edit, like the camera edits your photo and the colors and stuff in a certain way to give you that certain look, like a filmic look, for example, or a nice black and white look, whatever. And it bakes that into a JPEG. That edit doesn't get recorded on the RAW. You still have the RAW image there. So if you wanted to go back and re-edit that later on, you can, right? Or you decide like, oh, I want to, use this as a color image rather than black and white, whatever. But because these color profiles are so beautiful, and they kind of emulate Fujifilm to an extent and whatever, you can really create some really cool images just with these color profiles. So in many respects, there's no need to shoot RAW there if that's what you're after. And I always find that, especially when we're going out to shoot some street photography, for example, I like to shoot in some of these color profiles. And very often then when I go back and I have both the JPEG with the baked in profile and the RAW file, I'll actually then go and I'll try and edit the RAW file so that it looks somewhat similar to the JPEG with the baked in profile. And I use it as a reference point almost. And then I kind of make it better from there. Yeah. And that works for me as a process. So JPEGs are not completely useless. In fact, they're very useful in many different ways. Like my daughter, who's nearly 10 now, when she goes out, I always get her to shoot in JPEG, because from her perspective, she's learning how to use the camera. Yeah. And in fact, she's learning how to use a camera, and she's also learning about like basic things like composition, which we'll come to in a second. And as she's learning these things, she needs to focus on this one aspect of what she's learning. Like if we're talking about composition and how to place, like she likes to shoot animals, photograph animals. She's thinking about where that subject is in the frame. And that's what occupies her mind. And I don't want her to get sidetracked with all the other decisions that need to be made, like which aperture to use and all that kind of stuff. Yeah. So her camera is most likely in auto or semi-automatic or whatever, so that she can really just think about, well, where am I placing myself? How far? She also shoots with a prime lens, so she has to actually use her feet to zoom in and out. So she's thinking about, okay, where do I need to be, like, in order to get this bird or this dog or whatever in the frame in the way that I want it. So she's making the creative decision, and then she's manipulating the camera to get the right composition going, basically. And that's really useful. And then she takes the shot, and we can then look at the JPEG afterwards, and it's basically almost like a practice photo. We can talk about what went well and what didn't go well and whatever, but she's not really going to edit very much, although she got into Photoshop Elements. Oh wow, I think recently. No way. And let that be said, that you have some flexibility with the JPEG as well, of course. So it's not like you can't edit a JPEG at all, because that's sometimes you hear that and it goes like, well, that's not true. You can edit absolutely JPEGs rather well, in Lightroom or in Photoshop. It's a bit like you can push RAW this far, but you can probably only push JPEG that exactly far, right, and Yeah. And when you're shooting extreme things, like for instance, some of the environmental portraits that I do, and absolutely the concept photography that I do, I'm in an extreme situation where I need extreme flexibility in the files.
Yeah.
And even I mean that really gets to the point then from a professional point of view, it's where you'd prefer Nikon files over other files.
Right.
You know, like I know that I have definitely more flexibility with a Nikon file than I have with a Fuji file. There's no question about that.
Yeah.
So
so not all RAW is made equally.
No, exactly. No RAW is made equal either. So
it's a question for you, because I'm not sure I've ever shot in anything other than JPEG and RAW at the same time.
Oh, really? Okay.
I don't think I've ever shot just RAW. I've always had the JPEG, just because space is irrelevant, and so I just have them both on for, well, why not?
Yeah, I usually only shoot RAW.
So here's a question for you.
Fuji,
when you look at, if you are shooting in just RAW with not RAW and JPEG, what image do you see on the back of the screen when you're reviewing?
That's a JPEG representation of it.
But still is a JPEG.
Yeah, but there's no JPEG actually saved on the card.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah. So that is the other thing you need to get used to when you start shooting in RAW, is that what you see in the back of the screen is not really what you're going to see on your computer screen. Once you
exactly. Yeah.
So that's, very often in the beginning, I remember like being surprised, looking at the screen on my computer thinking, that's not what it looked like on the back of my camera. Well, no, it isn't, because you actually saw a JPEG representation on there, and again, as you get used to shooting like that, you get used. Like, for instance, one good example is this. I had a discussion with somebody else about this the other day, actually. So when we go out to shoot street, I like to shoot in black and white, and so I set my camera to give me a black and white view of the image. So when I take the image, it comes up on the screen. It shows me the black and white version of that image. Very cool. I like it. I know. It tells me whether I need to adjust my contrast or my blacks or my white point or whatever, the shadows or the highlights or whatever, so that I get the look that I want to get. All cool. When I import the RAW into the computer, they are color images, because RAW basically records everything, all the colors. I then have to start thinking about what I saw on the camera, which was black and white. So I then start to convert the RAW file into black and white, and then I can edit it in the way that I want it. But what I see on the back of the camera is just a reference for me when I'm shooting. It doesn't mean, it's not the be all and end all. It's not actually the actual image that I'm recording at the time. It's just a representation of it.
Absolutely.
And so, I virtually never shoot in JPEG and RAW on the Nikon, ever. It's I really only shoot in RAW. And the only time on the Fuji that I shoot both is when we're doing street photography. And the only reason I do that is because the JPEG will be in black and white then. And again, I'll just use it as a reference point for editing. Yeah. So I'll put them both next to each other in Lightroom, and I'll look at the black and white and I go, okay, I like this bit, the exposure, I like the way the shadows are there, but I don't like that bit because I want more, maybe the shadows have gone too far and I want a little bit more detail there. And that's how I then edit the RAW. But it's really just as a reference point. Yeah. Unless the very rare occasion where the JPEG is so awesome that I'll just go, I'm just going to go with that.
I'm not sure I can better that right now without a lot of work, so I'll just use the JPEG.
Yeah, or just generally,
There's like, nothing wrong with that.
It's just generally like, I love the way this looks. I'm totally good with that.
Yeah.
That's the thing. I mean, and you do that all the time in photography, especially, in digital photography, is that, for instance, you just take crop, for example. I always shoot things wider because I can always crop in. And there's like lots of people like, I never crop and all that kind of jazz. Totally cool. I like to have the option.
Absolutely. I get that. I've always kind of been that way. Recently, I've stopped to a certain extent because I'm just trying to better my composition at the minute. I'm just trying to nail it as much as I can. Because the R6 is only 20 odd megapixels. Yeah. Which is plenty, by the way. Absolutely plenty.
For sure.
When you just start cropping a little, you actually drastically reduce that. Now, so if I ever do want to do something with it other than it being on social, then I want as much resolution in there as I can get. So I try to get it as close as humanly possible in camera, but who has ever done that perfectly unless they're sat on a tripod and they're sat there for ages? If you're just walking around, that's never going to happen. It's never going to happen. So I always crop a little, and more often than not to change the aspect ratio than anything else.
Yeah, I mean, this aspect ratio is you straighten things up a little bit and you lose a little bit around the edges, or you want to kind of zone in and stuff.
I don't think there's ever been a photo I've not straightened.
Yeah,
I'm just not that strong.
Well, that's one thing, and also I know that there's a slight discrepancy between what I see in the viewfinder as opposed to what happens on the screen. I know that. Plus, I mean, there's like lens distortion and all the rest of that, and blah blah blah. You know, so straightening is just a normal standard sort of thing. And you know, I mean, the same thing happened in the dark room back in the day. So let's face it.
Of course,
that's just super standard kind of a thing.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean.
I also find if I'm out on the street and I'm just using a 35, which is what I typically use at the moment because I just love it. It's just I'm really loving it. Yeah. Sometimes I've had to take a photo so quickly and I'm too far away because I was just going to miss it completely. It just wasn't going to happen. By the time I got into a position where the composition was really good, it was over and it was gone. I'd rather take the shot and crop in and lose a load of resolution than miss the shot entirely.
Yeah, well, I mean, this is like saying, you know, it's the old saying, like a grainy shot is better than no shot.
Yeah.
I mean, you know,
I love grain. I add grain to my photos.
I mean, you know, that's the thing. I mean, the focus...
Not Lightroom's grain because I don't like it, but I do add grain.
Yeah.
It smooths the whole image out. You even when you can't see the grain.
Yeah.
It adds a element that wasn't there before.
Yeah.
It takes an edge off that...
Yeah, the grain in Lightroom can work well.
Yeah,
it depends on how you use it for sure.
I add grain to all my video.
Yeah,
most, not all of it.
I use grain a lot in compositing.
Blend stuff nicely.
I tend to use lots of it because it just looks so much more unreal.
Yeah,
when you don't use grain,
it's a level of blending that you don't get any other way.
It binds things together.
It does.
Like that's that's the thing. So a good example there would be, for instance, so when we do car shoot, you know, very often or more often than not, you'll take the license plate out.
Yeah.
And so you replace it with just the color of the car, you know. But if you just replace it with the color, it would look totally fake because there's always an element of grain in the image, and so therefore there'll be some grain on the rest of the car. So by adding, you know, by painting over the license plate, in a sense, you need to add some grain to make that look realistic, as if it's actually part of the car. That's a really good example. And you find that a lot with car photography, actually, is that you add grain to just blend things in.
Absolutely. It's a bit like adding, if you're doing a composite like that, you're doing something like that, is making sure you add enough blur to what you're adding based on where it is in the depth of field.
Yeah.
And it's not stuff, again, these are, all right, we're slightly off track a little bit.
It's getting a little bit more advanced.
But these are all just things to start considering and thinking about as you develop and grow.
So here's the last one. Let's limit it a little bit because we could talk about lighting and posing. Or maybe we'll do two things.
We'll talk more next time, can't we?
Yeah. So, but one thing that's a real beginner mistake in inverted commas, or something that will really enhance your photography if you are just starting out, is that lack of movement or lack of action in a frame. So good examples are here. This is a standard example of this sort of thing. Somebody takes a picture of their dog sleeping. It's like, okay, that's your dog sleeping, but there's not actually anything happening in that photo. It's much more interesting when the dog's actually doing something. Maybe the dog's jumping up, or he's like playing with his ball, or something like that. That's a more interesting image.
Yeah.
But as a beginner, we often think like, oh, that's a cute, you know, I just take a picture of my dog while he's sleeping on the couch. That's a cute picture of my dog. And of course, to you it is, because you have an emotional connection with that dog.
Exactly.
But nobody else does.
Yeah.
So, you know, it's the same thing really in portraiture to an extent. You know, we take a picture of another human being just standing there. And it's like, okay, well, that might have a lot of meaning to me because that might be my wife or my kid or something like that, or my grandma or whatever. But to somebody else, this means nothing because it's just another human being, another, bag of flesh standing there doing nothing.
Just to clarify, so bag of flesh, yeah? That's what we're going with. Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. Just making sure.
Another flash bag just standing there,
Oh, God.
Exactly. So, but it's just like, there's no, you don't have a connection with that person.
Yeah.
Yeah. So in order to connect with what's happening in the image, that person needs to do something. Some action needs to take place in there. So for instance, if you have, I don't know, a juggler juggling something or like a magician doing something like, some like handling an object or something like that, immediately there's more interest in the image because you're not only taking in the person itself, but also what the person is doing. And so you can get fascinated by the action itself, and what comes with that very often are like different facial expressions or something that they're very hard to coax out of somebody. But they happen quite naturally when people are in the process of doing something.
Yeah.
And that's
true.
where the interest comes from. So in the beginning, you can, if you just think of that little fact that you want to introduce or you want to incorporate some action or some movement in your picture, then that will lead to like creative thoughts that make for a much more interesting picture. I mean, cars, we were talking about cars. Good example, take a picture of a car in your parking lot. Okay. But if you take a picture of a car in movement, like in motion, like for instance, when you're doing a panning shot, for example, or just simply like a really cool action shot of a car, these images look more interesting than just a stationary car in a parking lot.
Yeah.
Or on your drive or something like that. So anyway, so we'll leave it at that. For this week, we'll include some tips maybe as a segment. We could make this a segment. That could be a cool segment.
Done.
Cool.
Awesome.
Awesome.
Love it. Good idea.
And yeah, because there's tons of stuff we can talk about.
Yeah. We can talk all day about it.
How to pose people. I get asked about this all the time.
They're not people, they're bags of flesh.
Oh, bags of flesh. How to pose flashbacks.
Oh, God. And on that bombshell.
I'm a flashback photographer.
Oh my.
That's it. So that being said, we have come to the end of this week's episode of the Camera Shake podcast. But of course, remember, if you want to be part of the community, head over to camerashakepodcast.com and hit the join our community button, where we will not bombard you with lots of newsletters and news. But once in a while, we might send you a little reminder to let you know of all the other awesome stuff that we're up to. We're already planning some things for later on in the year where I might be able to meet up with people. That is provided things open up a little bit more and hopefully towards the autumn or something that might be possible.
Absolutely.
So that should be cool. So again, camerashakepodcast.com, head over there. If not, it would really help us out if you hit the subscribe button and hit that bell if you're watching on YouTube. Likewise, just leave us a little bit of a star rating or review on Apple Podcasts. That would be superb. That being said, we'll be back next week. I'm going to go on Hollybobs. In fact, by the time you see that, I might already be
You'll
back.
be back.
I'll be back. Oh, I'll be on the way back anyway. So, send us some love. But we will see you again next week with another amazing guest. So watch out for that.